Senator Bacik, and you have 10 minutes as you are the leader of that group.
And I'd like to welcome the Minister to the House. You're very welcome, Minister, and to welcome this historic debate in which we're debating the bill that at last, after 35 years, will give the people the right to vote on whether or not to retain the 8th Amendment, inserted all those years ago, which has had such a chilling effect on so many since then. And just to commend you, Minister, on your really powerful speech and on all the great work you have done. I must say I found it personally very moving to watch you, Minister, and Minister Zappone and the Taoiseach stand together in January that evening and announce that a referendum will be held this year, and I really do commend you for that, and for at last facing the reality, the stark reality of so many women's lives in Ireland today. And I'm proud to stand here as a Labour representative. Labour will support the bill, of course, and we are a party that is united behind the recommendations of the Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment. I want to commend Senator Catherine Noone for her immense work in chairing that committee, and commend all the members of the committee, in particular our representative, Deputy Jan O'Sullivan. But we are united in our support for the proposal for legislation as well as for the proposal for repeal of the 8th Amendment. I am just about under 50, and I was too young myself to have voted in 1983, but I've lived all my adult life under its chill, under the chill of the 8th Amendment, and I can't actually believe that I now have 2 young daughters growing up under the same chill, and I certainly don't want them to reach adulthood with the same constraints and facing the same sort of restrictions on their reproductive health care that so many women have faced for so long. And I suppose I felt that chill particularly personally as a student, union officer, when we were taken to court by SPUC, the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child, in 1989, and threatened with prison for giving information on phone numbers of clinics in Britain to women in crisis pregnancy. And I will never forget the desperation in the voices of the women who phoned us, in the faces of the women who called into our student union office in Trinity, in seeking that information, which was not then accessible to them anywhere else, because SPUC had closed down women's counselling centres under the 8th Amendment in a series of often forgotten cases on information rights. And at the time we were subjected as students to vitriol, to hate mail, to horrible abuse, at a time when the debate was extremely polarised and extremely unpleasant. And I'm glad, I hope this time around we'll see a difference in debate. Certainly Senator Riley referred rightly to really nasty language used in the Seanad chamber during the 2013 bill debates, but I hope it will be different this time, as I think it has been so far. But I must say I never regretted the stance we took as students, even though it was hard as a 21-year-old. And certainly in London, subsequently, I worked with the Irish Women's Abortion Support Group as a volunteer, and we provided accommodation to Irish women coming to London for terminations of pregnancy there, and again met so many women in such difficult personal circumstances, for all of whom pregnancy had been a crisis, and a crisis that was compounded by having to travel, having to stay with strangers, having to raise the money for terminations in a foreign clinic. And I think of women like that all the time. I mean, as you said, Minister, there are 10 women travelling still every day. I can't believe we're decades on and we're still in that position. We know that the last year's figures that are available from the British Department of Health, 3,265 women. We know about 1,700 or 1,800 women a year at least are importing pills now into Ireland. So we know there's about 5,000 women from Ireland having terminations of pregnancy every year. We know that more than 160,000 have done so since 1983. And as you've said, these are not just figures, these are women in each of whose cases we've seen a terrible crisis in pregnancy compounded by having to travel. And we know the 8th Amendment has not prevented abortion, as you've said, it simply has compounded the crisis. It's created and generated a whole series of tragic cases, and others have outlined those. Others have spoken of the tragic death of Savita Halapanova in October 2012, which I think really did change people's opinion. I think a lot of medical people, for example, realised really just the true extent of the chilling effect that the 8th Amendment was having on medical practice. And of course the Act that we then passed subsequently to provide for the circumstances for life-saving terminations of pregnancy did not open a floodgates, as Senator O'Sullivan pointed out. We've seen only 25 or 26 terminations a year since then, 77 in total, to save women's lives. But even since that Act was passed, of course, we've seen further tragic cases. The PP case in 2014 in particular, that absolutely horrific case where a young woman with 2 small children was artificially kept kept alive while her body decayed. And Dr. Peter Boylan has spoken very movingly at the launch of the Together for Yes campaign, which I know you attended, Minister, about the horrific nature of that case, again caused and brought about by the 8th Amendment. So I think the process that has led us to where we are, to this, the introduction of this bill, through the Citizens' Assembly, which I also commend, and of course through the Joint Oireachtas Committee, is a very robust process. It's a process that reflects, I think, a real change in public opinion over the decades since the 8th Amendment was passed, and it reflects a recognition of the real harm and damage that the 8th Amendment has caused to women and to doctors and to medical practice in this country. And to speak briefly about the committee's recommendations, and I would also urge others to read the excellent report of the committee. Why did the committee recommend that abortion should be available without specific indicators up to 12 weeks? Well, it was very clear. They did so on the basis of the reality that they had heard about, of women already accessing the pill without medical supervision online, with all the dangers that entails, as others have said, up to 12 weeks, and that's a reality. And they heard also about the impossibility of providing in legislation for terminations in cases of rape otherwise. And indeed, I must say, as a member of our own Labour Commission some years ago, we struggled with how you legislate for abortion in cases of rape. It is simply impossible. There is no diagnostic test for rape, and short of asking women to go through an interrogation or a second ordeal after having been raped, it really is impossible. And I know that the committee heard expert evidence to that effect, and I think it was a very valid and robust reason to recommend the 12-week period as they did. And I think that it was also clear, if one followed the medical evidence, just how strongly the medical evidence was in support of repeal, to the point where I know Senator Nunes said it was impossible to find a medical expert who would testify for retention of the 8th Amendment. So severe has been the impact of the amendment upon medical practice. And again, the evidence itself is worth referring to. But I want to speak briefly about another reason the committee gave for reaching its recommendation, not just the medical evidence and the practical realities of women's lives, but also the international human rights obligations, of which Ireland has been found to be in breach in numerous cases. In the ABC case in 2010, in the Amanda Mellett and Siobhan Whelan cases much more recently, where we saw the United Nations Human Rights Committee making an extremely serious finding that Ireland had breached the rights of both those women who had both had, as you know, Minister, faced fatal fetal abnormality. They were described as having been subjected by the state to intense physical and mental suffering by having to travel to another country while carrying a dying fetus, the shame and stigma associated with the criminalisation of abortion, a huge factor again that we need to remember, that any woman who orders the pill online is facing that shame and stigma and fear of criminalisation. And as the UN Human Rights Committee said, the fact of having to leave the babies remains behind and later having them delivered by courier, and the state's refusal to provide necessary and appropriate care. So a whole range of reasons for which Ireland was found in breach in those two very recent decisions in Mellett and in Whelan. And those two brave women, again, really I suppose, illustrating the need to change our law on abortion. So I think there are many imperatives to hold this referendum. I think the Oireachtas Committee has made those clear. I would agree with others in calling on all colleagues to take a stand on this on a cross-party, cross-political basis. We are asking anyone who is in favour of repeal and in favour of the Joint Oireachtas Committee recommendations to stand with us tomorrow morning at an event at 11 o'clock, and an email has been sent out about that. And really what we're saying is, just as we should be trusting women, just as we should trust women in changing our law on abortion, so too should we not be afraid to ask the people to trust us as legislators to pass legislation to provide for the necessary legal framework so that we can provide women with the reproductive health care that we all need in a caring and a compassionate manner. And I think that legislators, again we must be able to say that legislators are the appropriate lawmakers. Indeed, we are constitutionally the lawmakers in the state. For far too long we have neglected our responsibility and abdicated it and handed it over to judges, to unelected judges who have not been it's not been appropriate that women's health care has been regulated in that way, through the courts, through the vagaries of particular court cases, or through tragic circumstances that have arisen in so many cases. So I hope that this year, in 2018, as we celebrate the centenary of women's suffrage and mark 100 years since we got the right to vote, that will finally be the year where we will win we will win finally the referendum of the yes vote to ensure that we can legislate for women's reproductive health care, that we can legislate to ensure women have the compassion and care they need, and that we reflect a changing society, and that we end the chill for the sake of our daughters and for their generation. And I think Jerry Edwards spoke very movingly at the Together for Yes launch, that we have stopped dropping pregnant women and girls at the doors of Magdalen laundries, but we now need also to stop dropping our pregnant women and girls at the departure gates of our airports and our ports. And I think those are really prescient and moving words, and we should all bear them in mind as we stand together for repeal and to pass this referendum bill.